Right. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'm doing this talk because there's a lot of threats going on where Trump is throwing a lot of threats at Iran, and I'm seeing a lot of well-intentioned people saying no to war, and some people actively advocating for war. And I find that there's a lot of problems with both positions, and I noticed it in Syria, where people assume that just because there's a geopolitical rivalries, we need to specifically take a side, but I'm here to make the case that we need to respond to these threats in a much different way, to have our activism be completely different. This talk is more of an introductory talk. It's trying to get people thinking about the issue differently, and hopefully it'll lead to more effective organizing. I don't have a lot of time to go through the history, but quick summary. Since 1953, Iran has had 3 governmental changes. One, in 1953, our democratically elected prime minister was overthrown by an alliance between the US and the British because he wanted Iranian oil to go to Iran. And he was replaced by the Shah, which is the Farsi word for king. And he had a monarchy that lasted for about 25 years. And then his monarchy was overthrown by the Islamic movement in Iran, and they set up what they call an Islamic Republic, which is like a Jeffersonian-style democracy, but then a council of religious elders to overrule whatever that democracy comes up with. And so I think the important thing to understand is that from the very beginning, this regime came to power with repression. They had a popular base, and they did have a lot of supporters, but there was a lot of mass protests against the Shah at the time, and there were a variety of coalitions. There were constitutionalists, moderates, leftists, communists, democratic socialist people. They weren't called that back then. And the Islamic Republic just managed to take power and overthrow the other factions. And instead of being integrated into the apparatus, they had to use mass repression in order to suppress dissent. It's really not known how many people died in regime prisons at the beginning, but it was known that anyone who wasn't on board or was criticizing the regime, or the revolution, as they called it, they faced torture and imprisonment, and a lot of people died during that time. And since then, you'll see a lot of protest movements that have come up in Iran, and the regime survived partly due to war, partly due to violence, partly due to repression. So some of the examples is there's always been conflicts with students. Like university students the universities in Iran has been the space where people tend to organize the most, where they feel like they can challenge the regime. And the regime picks up on this and starts to crack down on them, tell them what they can teach, and really undermine their education system. There were student protests in 1999, 2009, that ended up with brutal crackdowns. So there have been a few protest movements in the past 10 years. The famous one that a lot of people know about was in 2009 when a hardliner named Ahmadinejad won the presidency. He was seen as closer to the religious council. And people alleged, and the evidence was pretty strong, that there was fraud. So there were huge protests, and they wanted reform, civic democracy, and they were mostly met with violence and brutal crackdowns. Then in 2011 and 2012, a new wave of protests started again to complement the Arab Spring, and they were repressed too. Then what we see is, in addition to repression of popular movements that claim to speak for all of Iran, the regime also has a history of repressing its minorities. There's one region in Iran called Khuzestan, which is mostly Arab, and it was ranked by the World Health Organization as the dirtiest city in the world because a lot of dirty projects, a lot of high-intensity resource extraction projects are concentrated there. And there are a lot of resistors and protesters that come out every single year to try to challenge the Iranian regime's treatment of them. And one thing you notice is that when Bush declared a war on terror, it spread everywhere. And so you see people in the Al-Ghazi region are sometimes charged with, even civil society activists are charged with arbitrary accusations of being a terrorist. Given there are some Al-Ghazi separatists who are violent and who have attacked soldiers, but there are lots of civil society groups, and they get repressed too. It's known that the Kurds and Afghans aren't treated well in Iran. Near the end of this presentation, I'm going to be talking a little more about the protests in the last 2 years, which have been primarily labor strikes and teacher strikes. One thing a lot of people don't understand in the anti-war movement is that even though Iran's repression is domestic and primarily domestic, and they're not the major power in the region, they are known to intervene in other countries. And so there's the Hekmatist party. I saw a speech by one of their members, and he said that it's a far-left party in Iran, that they want people to, in the anti-war movement, to start focusing on proxy wars. Wars that aren't necessarily two nations declaring war and sending all their troops, but taking advantage of conflicts to spread their interest. The most obvious example is Syria, where I've heard people say that Iran legitimately turned the tide of the Syrian war in favor of Assad. They've spent tens of billions of dollars, some estimates say hundreds, and you see that this is a common grievance among labor strikers in Iran, where they're saying, why are you spending money on Syria? We're hungry, we're starving, why don't you spend some money on us? And so you'll see that in Yemen too, where the Saudi Arabia and UAE are committing a horrific massacre against the Yemeni population, but we also need to be aware that the Houthis, even though they started off in Yemen, they do have some support from Iran, and Iran has played a role in sectarianizing and worsening the conflict. Oh, and the point I forgot to make is one thing we need to be aware of is Saudi Arabia and Iran are in this intense war of ideas where Iran claims to be the spokesperson for the Shia branch of Islam, and Saudi Arabia claims to be with the Sunni branch, and they always execute each other's clerics, they're always provoking each other, and I think it's important that no activist gets involved in taking one side. You need to be critical of the actions they take. So as we're starting to see more and more groups step up and try to have a strong anti-war message and prevent war with Iran, we also need to be aware of what kind of activism that might cause harm. This is a picture of Medea Benjamin, founder of Code Pink, the largest anti-war group in the US. And you see this is a picture of her meeting with foreign ministers. They do these peace delegations to Iran where they take pictures with government officials, and their intentions are good. They're trying to say, look, Iranian people are awake, we shouldn't attack them, but at the same time, they're not meeting with the people. They're not meeting with people who are struggling. And they go and they get better treatment than most Iranians because they're effectively serving as a propaganda group for them. So I think we need to call out Code Pink, and if they're going to do peace delegations, they need to do it differently. And then another group that actually does have a lot of Iranian supporters is called the National Iranian American Council. I'm not going to slander them. They do have some positions right on Iran. They will condemn its human rights abuses. But I'm going to argue that the way they choose to frame the issue makes people choose solidarity with the nation state rather than the struggling people. And I have a few quotes from them from one of their press releases. While Iranian elections have serious limitations, and by limitations they mean like you can't choose who you vote for, it's like the regime handpicks who you can vote for, they're at least marked by sharp debate and campaigning. Which, it's not the people's experience with elections. People kind of know it as a fraud, they don't feel they're represented. And then they said, despite sporadic protests since last January, it's actually since 1979, there exists no cohesive revolutionary movement. Near the end of this presentation, I'm going to challenge this point and say that Iranian resistance does have what it needs to run its own country. It just needs support. Next slide. And I'm just going to make a quick note. Like we noticed in Syria, where Assad and US are officially enemies, but there have been lots of weird proxy wars, geopolitical alliances, and the US coalition did help Assad stay in power. And the people's inability to notice that like alliances are kind of fluid, and I think that's hurt people. So I think we need to include an analysis of proxy wars in our anti-war activism, and I think we also need to focus on the effects of policies on people instead of just going and standing with different regimes. Despite everything I've said about what the regime's doing, I do think it's more important that we do have a strong anti-war stance. War doesn't help anyone really. This regime is very, very entrenched in society. You would not be able to like remove them and then all of a sudden have Iran become a civil democracy. I think the amount of damage it would take would destroy a lot of civilian apparatus. A lot of the pro-democracy protesters would be the first target. And it's important to remember that some historians have argued the regime has survived because of wars. The Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s, which the US supported Iraq against Iran, helped consolidate the position of the regime. And then the recent Iraq war, Iran did a lot of geopolitical kingmaking, and now Iraq is very closely tied to them, and it's what helps them prop up their economy. So we should have an anti-war movement, but it should stand with the struggling people of Iran, which I will now talk about. So I've identified 4 major protest camps, which I think are just a few examples of civil society actors, laborers, human rights lawyers who can get together and create the foundation of a different society for Iran. This is a picture of Nasreen Sotoudeh. She's a human rights lawyer who was arrested for standing up for human rights advocates in the 2009 protests, spent a bunch of time in prison. And then, I believe it was last year, she was arrested again for insulting the supreme leader and is facing brutality and torture in prisons. Then there's Ahwazi prisoners. Well, one is Amina Zaheri. She's a cultural activist. She's 20 years old. She is in prison. She's faced torture. And she's in this prison called Sepidar prison, which is notorious for being abusive. And the prison doctors are trying to have recommended that she leave the prison and get treatment, but the administrators won't let her go. And you'll see, if you study Iran and Iranian history, these political prisoners always exist. There's always more than you can name, and we need to be aware of their story. A recent movement, which isn't what you would think of conventional protest movement, was in response to a major disaster. There were these heavy rains in Iran a few months ago, and they caused mass flooding, mass property damage. And a lot of the regime response has shown a severe corruption in their bureaucracy. You'll see the president actually blamed weathermen for not predicting the rain, and then they just pulled up the report and found that they did predict the rain. And there's all these problems with how they manage their riverbanks, especially in the Ahwazi region where they're known to have the most destructive projects. They've kind of messed with, they've just broken a lot of protocol for how you treat floodplains. And so what's happened is that people said, I'm going to take this in my own hands. The regime's not going to help me. And so there have been these networks of laborers, mostly teachers, who take charge of providing humanitarian aid, but other laborers will help too. Like people will offer free vehicle repairs, they'll donate part of their salaries to people's houses. And it's been shown that teachers are the most trusted civil society group in Iran. But we also see the regime gets jealous sometimes, and it's arrested a few people on arbitrary charges because they were helping people. From the start, one of the biggest places of protest are university students. A lot of times, historically, it's been an argument of the regime to say university students are just kind of like rich Westerners. They don't speak for Iran. But they got some attention because they came out and protested in solidarity with the labor strikers. Where I have a video later in this presentation. And so now I see this as a unique opportunity where we see both university-educated people and workers coming together and creating a new mass movement. And then there were actual physical laborers who started striking due to economic conditions. Ahwazi steelworkers came together. They were really tired of the factory management. It had been going on for years. And what they said is, look, we're not going to listen to you. You don't know how to manage this factory. People are getting hurt. And they kicked out the management. And as of 4 or 5 months ago, they were running the factory on their own. But a lot of their leaders have been arrested. There's a few of their leaders in prison right now. And it's kind of hard to follow the news with these things, but I understand that the regime has taken the factory back. But there is tensions with the workers, and there is a whole political culture of resistance now there. So these are some pictures. These two, Sepida Golian and Ismail Baks, are Avazi protesters. They participated in the steelworker protests. This picture up here is a convoy of the president, Hassan Rouhani, trying to drive through town, and a bunch of mining workers blocked his car and are yelling at him, telling him to reform the system. And that's their president. It's kind of crazy that they got that confrontational. This was a famous protest. I forget this woman's name, but Iran has a mandatory hijab law for women. She said, I'm not going to wear this anymore, and she went to prison for 2 years because of it, but I think she just got out. And then this was a labor strike. So I think one of the things we need to focus on is, it is important that we have sanctions relief, because sanctions kind of squeezes people and makes it hard to get medicine. But it did kind of backfire in this case, where when the sanction money was released, it didn't go to Iranians who needed help or needed medical relief. It went to Syria, because shortly after the Iran deal, Iran committed more troops in Syria and increased its involvement. And you'll see a few protests, their chant is, stop spending money on foreign interventions, we need an investment here at home. So I see what we have two situations where we need to be aware of. Like, we need to have a movement that advocates for sanctions relief, that doesn't use collective punishment. But right now, the current situation is when the money comes from sanctions relief, it goes to the Iranian state apparatus, it goes to their corrupt bureaucracy, it goes to their destructive projects, it goes to proxy wars. What I think we should do is we elevate the voices of these protest movements. And so once their voices are elevated, they have a more complex civilian media apparatus, their demands are known to the public, they can be in a position where they can actually get concessions from the government. And in this case, it was seen as a loss, because all this money, which could have helped improve Iranian quality of life, went to Syria. And not like a good intervention in Syria, it's a military intervention. So I see our role as activists is to follow these protests and publicize their demands, help them organize. Ask your union or professional organization to send out statements of support, especially for the causes that might seem a little more apolitical and you can convince them, like the flood relief workers. We're doing a lot of fundraising for their needs. Also, in the anti-war movement, we need to call out regime apologism. I mean, it's kind of a big issue. I think a lot of far-left groups tend to side with these regimes, and they go to a lot of conferences and they get their views, I don't know, they really push their views aggressively. I've gone in a lot of arguments. And so we need to be vigilant, we need to be aware of the voices of the people and be aware of how proxy wars affect the people on the ground, not just the regime. So we need to think outside this narrative of governments versus governments, or dictators versus terrorists. We need to know everywhere in the world there's people fighting for dignity. But if we let the sectarians dominate the message, then we lose. So I'm just going to conclude. We can watch a few videos of protests, and then that's my presentation. I don't know if it's going to work because it might not be logged in, but.
I don't know, do we have internet?
Oh, no.
There should be. I turned off the. Oh, we turned it off. I don't think we have time now.
Okay.
I don't think we have time for the videos because it's already 8 o'clock.
Okay, well, I'll just summarize what's in them. I believe I included a video of a May Day strike, which was in Tehran and a few other cities where people were saying solidarity with the workers, bring back money from Syria, stand with the people, we're against the regime corruption. There were videos of teacher strikes all over the country because the regime is trying to privatize its education system and make it more profitable, and people are resisting that. And there were also labor strikes, like the steel workers who took control of their factory, they're having meetings, they're trying to build worker councils. So it's all exciting. I hope we can support them the right way.
source where we can use some of this or get more information on this? Is there a good website you can guide us to, or on Facebook?
Yeah, I mean, there's Iranian General News, which we'll cover, and then I follow a few civilian journalism pages. Like there's one called Iran Protest Live Information. They seem to just have people all over the country. They get it. They have pretty strong networks. And then there's also a Facebook page called Solidarity with Mina workers. Mina is Middle East, North Africa. I follow them too.
I'll introduce you. That was excellent, thank you.